So, ladies and gentlemen, now I'm very happy to introduce to you Alison Winter. Alison Winter ist seit 10 Jahren für die BBC tätig, aktuell in der Funktion Head of Audiences, Radio and Education. Sie überwacht zum Beispiel die Performance-Analysen und die Publikumsforschung, und zwar in den Bereichen Radio, Fernsehen und Online für die Abteilung BBC Radio and Education. Zuvor arbeitete sie als Research Manager für fast alle britischen Radiostationen der BBC und während 9 Jahren als Head of Audience Insight beim Branchenverband der kommerziellen Radios Radio Center. Aujourd'hui, Alison Winter va nous parler des nouvelles habitudes d'utilisation et de la plateforme audio innovante BBC-Sounds. BBC-Sounds réunit la radio live avec la radio sur demande, la musique et les podcasts. Réjouissons-nous de pouvoir jeter un coup d'œil en primeur sur les processus internes, les obstacles et les coopérations. We're very happy to welcome you here on stage. Welcome, Alison Winter.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you here today in beautiful Zurich and this lovely venue. A confession, I have only school-level French. My German is pretty non-existent, so thank you for allowing me to speak in my native English. If you've seen me speak at conferences before, I can sometimes be accused of talking very fast, so I am going to slow down today. If I start speeding up, then just wave at me. I'm here to talk to you today about the BBC's biggest service launch in over a decade, BBC Sounds. And I'll start by showing you just a short demo reel that was made to explain what BBC Sounds is to our own staff in the BBC, but also to suppliers and also to third-party audio providers who we might want to work with.
So, BBC Radio 1. Now, come on, Mayo Sounds.
Hi, don't you look well?
So, coming from a research background, I obviously want to share with you, first of all, how audience insight was at the heart of the development of Sounds, and what that meant in terms of how the product looks and how it functions, and then end with some of the new ways of working that we've had to adapt to in the BBC, and some of the inevitable challenges that BBC Sounds is still throwing up for us. And although this is a BBC initiative, I'll explain how we are open to working with third parties on this, and I hope that whether you come from public service or commercial, that there'll be something in here that might inspire you or some food for thought. And one final word of warning before we get going on this: Sounds is still a very young child. It's only 9 months old this month, so we're still learning and we are still evolving. But first of all, why Sounds came about. And I'm not going to start our day here, this lovely day in Zurich, with those so-called charts of doom. Do you know the ones which have got those sort of linear time spent trending downwards? I'm sure you've all seen enough of those, as have I. I'm going to share some other data points with you that gave us some food for thought about where we could make a positive difference in trying to arrest some of that decline. And first of all, this comes from a quarterly UK survey called Midas, which comes from our industry survey Radar, and it looks at the whole audio landscape, so that's beyond radio and beyond the live listen. And this is showing you the share of the audio day on the left for all adults and on the right for the younger 15 to 24 demographic. And what you can clearly see is that live radio, in the black there, is accounting for just under 40% of young adults' time, versus 70% almost for all adults. And this 40% is trending downwards. It's down by 6 percentage points from last year. And set against that, what we're seeing is an increase for music streaming, which is the big block in yellow, and also for podcasts. They're relatively small at the moment, this 5%, but they're growing. And that very different shape of the audio day is driven chiefly by the different ways in which young people are accessing audio. And that's primarily by connected devices, like laptops, which are there in orange. Also voice-activated speakers at the end in green. These are really small at the moment, but they're growing. And I think a colleague of mine from the BBC, Nathan Freeman, is going to be speaking about those and what the BBC is doing to understand how to engage audiences with voice later on. But chiefly, of course, the key connected device young audiences are listening to audio through is smartphones, and that's occupying almost 40% of the time they spend with audio in the red there. If we look at how many 15 to 24s listen via smartphone every week, it's 80%, over 8 in 10. And that's set against just over half who listen via traditional radio sets, whether that's DAB or analog. And if we look in more detail at the listening just on smartphone, you can see the challenge for radio here because it's dominated by music streaming. So up to 60% of their audio hours on smartphone are music streaming. And it's actually up to 1 in 3 hours almost for all adults up there. The latest Midas survey from Radar showed us a record 92% of 15 to 24s said they'd ever listened to music streaming online, which is huge. That's almost universal. Interestingly as well, for both age groups here, the third biggest share of their audio day on the smartphone is podcasts. That's the purple block. And that's something that we're seeing growing in the UK. According to the latest Radar figures, there's a record 7.1 million adults in the UK listening to podcasts on a weekly basis. That's 13% of the population. And that's a huge 24% increase year on year. And on the right, you can see how this breaks down by ages. And similar to the last speaker, it's skewing very much to that young audience. Almost 1 in 5 of 15 to 34s choosing podcasts on a weekly basis. So I think you get the point where all this is going. I've just got a few slides to sum up why we took all this data and we thought in the BBC that doing nothing, staying as we were, really wasn't an option for us. And firstly, we were struck by just how different the audio behaviours of young people were versus their older counterparts. And really, we were starting to see two very different, distinct groups emerge here. You've got the older listeners who are still skewing to live radio. They grew up with live radio. They're listening to it on demand as well. And the younger listeners were going instead to on-demand music services and digital tracks, as well as podcasts. And that's all increasing. And of course, the million-dollar question that me and my team get asked all the time is, well, won't the younger listeners just become the older listeners in time, and their listening habits will adapt? And we don't think that is a risk we want to take. If we look at Radar data, and it's a separate group every week, so it's not a continuous panel, but if we look in 2008 at the 15 to 24-year-olds in red there, they were listening to 15.3 hours per head a week of live radio. If you look at their counterparts, the 25 to 34s that have grown into in 2018, they're listening to less radio. It's about an hour and a quarter less radio per week. So that old adage we have in the UK that people grow into radio doesn't seem to be holding true anymore. And longitudinal surveys like Midas also show us how these behaviours are accelerating. This is a chart we made firstly using our own data on the bottom, and this is how our current audio consumption is distributed at the moment. Live radio, on-demand radio, making up the majority of what people consume from the BBC. Then on the top, we've projected what the market might look like using Midas data, which measures everything in the market. And it looks very different, suggesting that we're going to have to shift to a fundamentally different model if we are satisfying audience needs in a few years. And the picture when you look at 16 to 34s is even more stark. Now, I should reiterate, this isn't the projection, what I'm saying the world will look like, but it's one model of where we think we should be heading, as I said, to satisfy those audience needs. So informed by all of this, Sounds launched in November last year. Now, some of you may know we already had, at that point, an online audio product, we still do, in fact, called iPlayer Radio. But we decided, rather than tinkering with that, or rebuilding it even, we needed to start from scratch. all of the data we had seen told us that we needed to build a wholly different kind of product for an audience, many of them who didn't know BBC radio stations, let alone love them. iPlayer Radio, in hindsight, was built for radio lovers. You needed to know the radio programme or station that you wanted to access to go on and put it into the search bar and get that content. In contrast, Sounds has been built for users of on-demand audio who want to discover the perfect thing to listen to at that moment. They don't need to know the programme name, they don't even need to know the station name. Which isn't to say, I should quickly point out, that radio is absent from Sounds. Radio is still a big part of Sounds, but it's one of the three offers we've got there. We've got music, we've got radio, we've got podcasts, as you saw on the demo reel. And alongside this shift to new types of content, we could also see that we needed to rethink how our audiences navigated to or found content in this world. Versus the browse and search mentality of iPlayer Radio, we were seeing figures that suggested that, for example, about 80% of Netflix plays were from recommendations, a similarly high 60% of plays from YouTube's homepage were from recommendations, and in the audio world, around 4 in 10 listeners using the Discover Weekly playlist from Spotify. But in contrast, when we looked at our own iPlayer Radio, only 4% of our users were going through recommendations. They were all doing the browse and search. So delivering more effective routes to content was at least as important for us as the content itself. And now I'll show you just a few examples of how all this content and all this research has come to life in the product. And firstly was this emphasis on on-demand content. The BBC has been using and creating podcasts since 2004, one of the earliest organisations to do so. But up until about 12 months ago, we'd only been using them as a mechanism for you to re-listen to a radio programme. So we developed a content catalogue framework for podcasts. This was based on audience needs that were previously identified in research with young people, and then overlaying a view of what the market was providing, and then we identified where there were gaps. And that led to this innovative new suite of podcast titles. These would never have surfaced on our linear stations because of their subject matter, because of their tone of voice, or because of the length of them, maybe. Some of them were based on existing audio brands, like the Radio 1's Live Lounge, some of them based on existing video brands, like the accompaniment to the BBC TV soap opera EastEnders. But also, some of the most successful have been brand new. They haven't been linked to any previous audio-video content, like that Peter Crouch podcast. But alongside the on-demand speech, we knew we needed a strong music offer. You saw in the slides at the beginning, yes, podcasts are growing, but on-demand music is by far the dominant audio share, especially for young people. But there was no point us trying to replicate what something like Spotify was already doing really well, and that would not be a good thing for the public service broadcaster to do. Instead, we wanted to harness and build on what is common to all of us in radio, our strong radio brands, our loved presenters who act as trusted guides and expert curators to this ever-expanding world of music content. So we built on something that we'd already been trying with Radio 1 a bit and having some success with, and that's music mixes. Again, we developed an offer. It comprises dozens of music mixes at the moment. They're designed to meet specific occasions in our audience's lives, or perhaps for mood management. So we've got things like Help Me Concentrate, the mindful mix there. I think we have a mix which might go down well today. It's for the morning after. If you've been partying the night before, there's a little mix to sort of gently bring you back to life the following day. We have a category that sits around events as well. So I think Reading and Leeds is here, but also we had the Notting Hill Carnival in London over the weekend. We've got content on that. So again, really introducing people to different content here. And alongside this new content, as I said, we wanted to put into the product new ways to find it. You can still search for your programme if you know the name for it, but also there are broad categories to choose from, and these are very different to the ones we had in the past. Drama, comedy, factual is what we had in the past. Here we've got things like health and well-being, crime and justice, audiobooks, and a huge range of music genres as well. We can also, thinking of our public service priorities and just our editorial highlights, we can still surface things that we want to. We've got a Things We Love section, which would have the Reading and Leeds Festival on at the moment, for example. But also thinking of how those big on-demand providers work, like Netflix and Spotify, this section has been key, the Recommended For You section. This is powered by increasing amounts of data we're getting through from our online audience. As the demo reel said at the beginning, the more you use sounds, the more it learns, and the more we can give you more that you love. And finally, in terms of how sounds is different from iPlayer Radio, something we wanted to bake into it from the start was the idea that it could surface not just BBC content, but content from third parties, and that's potentially across any of those three content groups: podcasts, music, and radio. And the desire to do this has been driven by a few things. Firstly, there are some strong public service ambitions that such a move would fit with. For example, that of taking the UK to the world and the world to the UK. It would also help us with our objective to drive the UK's creative economy by giving the wider audio industry access to audiences via our platform. But also, we're seeing, I'm sure like you, increasingly big global players entering our market like never before. Already, we estimate that Apple and Spotify account for around 80% of the music streaming and podcast markets in the UK. Choice and plurality are good, but dominance by one or two gatekeepers would not be. So with BBC Sounds, we want to offer an alternative audio destination to those global platforms within a fully competitive market that involves investment and choice from UK providers, BBC and commercial, as well as the large global players. Now, I'll return to the radio element of this in a moment, but the area we've had most success in so far is in podcasts. This was the area that we worked on from the start of the launch. And one very popular UK podcast we brought on board was The Guilty Feminist. It's been a fascinating way for us to start learning about working with third-party audio providers on the platform to understand the impact of that content on sounds and give us insights about the possibility of positioning ourselves as a platform. We're now thinking about the next steps. We need to be sure that any moves in this area represent good value for the BBC, good value for the licence fee payers. As a small example of this, at the moment, with all the third-party podcasts we bring on board, we're stripping the ads out of them, and we are spending time complying them to make sure they don't breach our editorial guidelines in the BBC. The idea of how that works at scale is unproven yet. And of course, from my point of view, I'm very keen to understand audience expectations in this area. But the idea of sounds as a platform open to all is something that's been baked in from the start, and I'll return to it in a moment. And that does actually lead me nicely to the final area I thought you'd be interested in hearing about. And that's about how we're adapting how we work at the BBC in the wake of sounds. And of course, some of the challenges we've encountered so far and are still encountering. I could probably do a whole presentation on challenges, but that would be a very negative start to the day. But first of all, this is a challenge, I suspect, not just of the BBC, but of all large, even medium-sized companies, and the so-called BBC blocks, our branding here, articulate that very well, because really the BBC in many ways is structured as a collection of multiple siloed businesses. So areas like editorial, product, marketing, communications, they operate in their own verticals too much of the time, and Sounds really needed them to come together and to be joined up and working in harmony. On a practical level too, we couldn't allow our radio stations to keep surfacing content online in their own ways. It wasn't sustainable, and we needed to find a common way of doing things. What we needed was a horizontal to cut across all these verticals. And I have to say that's where audience research and the insight that you've seen came to the fore. It really provided an impetus for change in the organisation. It led to one vision, one common view of the audience needs that Sounds would be addressing in the future, and that required a joined-up response from the business. I'm going to say a bit more about metrics for success right at the end, but we built dashboards that could be accessed by everyone, so that everyone working on Sounds got to see the same data, and crucially, that was top-line data, the really big numbers. And everyone was made to feel that they had a stake in those numbers. So it wasn't just about, anymore, how it used to be, understanding how your own programme or your own bit of the website was doing. You were responsible equally for that top number. And that single vision has also been a key part of our conversations with third-party audio providers, including UK commercial radio. Although, of course, we're competing with each other often for listeners' time, we do have a history of working together. We co-founded Radar, which is the industry measurement survey, and also DR UK, which represents digital radio in the UK. And a few months ago, the director of BBC Radio and Education, James Pennell, published this blog on the BBC website. And that's about the potential for sounds to act as a platform for other audio in the future. At this stage, it's very much about having the option for sounds to be something that can adapt to whatever our plans are in the future. So there isn't much more for me to say about this at the moment. But as you can imagine, whatever the future brings, it's going to take a lot of work on both sides to work this through and pull it off. But back to ways of working internally and some of the challenges we had, and that's the relationship between sounds and the linear brands. And this is another area that's probably still work in progress. This slide was actually used before we launched Sounds to try and talk to the BBC and BBC Radio about what sounds meant for them. And it shows how sounds really differs from the position with iPlayer radio. So in the former world, you can see here those famous BBC verticals, all the BBC radio stations operating on their own, and iPlayer radio is there really just as a distribution mechanism for their content. But in the new world, Sounds is at the heart of a strong audio offer. It acts as an access point for both live and on-demand radio, but it also offers up content itself that may be the first access point for audiences who know nothing of those audio brands. But Sounds can start them on a journey of discovery into a world they'd never have come across if we were waiting for them to turn on a radio and listen to the live radio. So, in fact, Sounds, as we've said to the brands, the station brands, it needs them to be strong linear brands in order to build momentum into the product and to provide content, whether that's credible music mixes from their presenters or best-in-class speech. And in return, Sounds can introduce audiences to the existing radio brands and what they have to offer. And along the same lines, another area to work through has been the process by which content is surfaced in Sounds. Maybe understandably, to begin with, a lot of the radio stations wanted the content to be badged with their radio station brands. But the trouble with that was we'd seen in previous research that some of our brands could be stumbling blocks to the audiences. The audiences weren't aware of our brands, or they had misperceptions about them, which might be incorrect, but they were misperceptions. And as we've seen in the on-demand space, often audiences aren't choosing like that anymore. They're choosing by mood or by occasion. And this tension is present sometimes still, but I think for many of our editorial staff, they now appreciate the creative freedom they get by producing content that sounds rather than Radio 1 or Radio 4. And that's bolstered when the audience tell us that they notice and appreciate a different tone of voice to Sounds. It sounds less formal, like we've loosened our tie a bit. It sounds sort of playful. It sounds different from what they expected to get from the linear radio stations. So it's giving us the opportunity to develop much-needed skills in making this type of content too. There are still occasions when we use our radio station brands. You can see the Friday night comedy, but the brand is secondary there. It's brought to you by Radio 4. And in this way, we hope listeners to Sounds will bump into the Radio 4 brand, have awareness raised or perception shifted, and it'll take them on a journey of discovery they'd never normally have been on. Another lesson with Sounds was that we shouldn't wait for everything to be perfect before launching. Again, this is probably very different from the way we operate in the linear world, especially when we're producing built radio programs for a station like Radio 4, our sort of more highbrow speech station. In the digital world, we can launch and then iterate based on user feedback and user testing, or frighteningly, from feedback from the real world. We have a good rating in the App Store now, but we certainly didn't have this at the outset. This is one of many I could have shown you. You do need to have nerves of steel to ride out the criticisms. But also, we engaged with those people. We spoke to them, we took their criticisms on board, and the product is stronger for it. There's a list of some of the version history you can see on the App Store and some of our reviews now, and an overall rating of 4.4, which is much better than when it was. But if you do that, you genuinely have to be prepared to pivot away from your plans, to move things up and down your product roadmap, or even introduce them. And to end, I'm moving back to where I started, and my favourite area, which is understanding the audience and audience research. Because a shift to this type of world means we also need to change the way that we distribute data. As I've said, this shared view of the product and how it's doing is what binds and motivates the different teams all over the UK working on sounds. But also the benefits of that will only really flow back if the data is accessible to everyone in the moment who can use it to make decisions. And that's very different from how we're used to using live radar data, where really accessing it is through my team and complicated systems. With sounds data, it's coming through every minute of every day. So we built, as I said, dashboards, online tools to help surface the data. This is how it appears on our audience's website in the BBC, so that everyone can get hold of it. And it really is used by everyone, from senior management to programme and product makers. I've heard these dashboards being described as addictive, which I don't think I've ever heard of audience data described in that way before. And alongside the move to open up data, we also need to think about different ways to evaluate success, moving beyond the old metrics we have in the radar world of reach and hours. We need to look at things like perhaps what content is bringing people into the product, so-called activating content. What is that? How can we do more of it? And then once we've got people in the product, what drives that all-important habit and keeps them coming back like they would to a live radio station? So as I said right at the beginning, we're still very early on with sounds. We're only 9 months into its life. We're still learning. Undoubtedly, we're still making mistakes. But we're still listening to our audience and still improving. Just recently, we announced a new permanent controller of sounds. His name is Jonathan Wall. He was the controller of our sport and live news network, Radio 5 Live, and I think we're really very excited to see how he shapes a specific, unique editorial tone of voice for sounds, which is probably what it's lacking at the moment. And just quickly about commercial radio, because what's equally fascinating is how they have been developing over that 9 months as well. They have not stood still. There were relaxation of guidelines in October that meant they were freer about where local content especially could be produced from. And that led to a reshaping of some already very strong brands like Capital and Heart. They are now genuine UK-wide offers. They have big name presenters on there, and they can deliver huge audiences to advertisers. And like the BBC, commercial radio has developed their own music-led response to that declining time spent with young audience. And they've developed these so-called brand extensions. So they're spin-off services available UK-wide digitally that sit under parent brands like Absolute, Classic or Heart. So at the beginning of the summer, Global started Heart Club Classics just in time for the dance season. On the back of that, only last week, Bauer Radio announced that it's launching seven new digital-only services, all music services, all based on existing audio brands Kiss, Kerrang and Heat. Virgin Radio relaunched as well in January this year, not as one service, but 3, all with a slightly different musical genre at the heart of it. And taking Chris Evans as its breakfast show presenter across all 3. Chris Evans had been the most successful breakfast radio presenter in Europe, I think. He'd been on Radio 2 up until December, where he built his audience to a record almost 10 million. So he is left to go to Virgin to see what he can do in this new digital venture. His show is record-breaking in many different ways and breaks the mould. I don't know if you've heard, but it has no adverts running through it. It's sponsored solely by Sky. Virgin itself is owned by News UK. They publish newspapers like The Times and The Sun. So there's a huge sort of opportunity there. And that might be behind Global Radio's recent move in the UK to purchase 2 big outdoor media companies, which makes it, at a stroke, the second biggest player in outdoor advertising in the UK. So even with huge global competition and evolving listener habits, the UK radio industry, BBC and commercial, is far from rolling over and accepting the challenges ahead, but we're facing the future head on. We're matching the best digital innovations with the best of our radio heritage. And I think that is summed up very well in how I'll leave you, which is the launch trail for sounds.
I woke up with a fear this morning, but I can tell. Oh, come on, seriously. This is the 5th time you've listened to that in a row. Why don't you try something else?
Hey, Try this. Going through a breakup again. I see a dozen women, then I break up with 10. I put them back together, then I
break out in tears every time I hear this.
It is so romantic. I'm glad I'm not the only
one. Of the things that this dance move says to me is I'm a woman, but I can still screw in a light bulb. I'm sure Queen Bee would agree. This is
unwatchable, kind of hideous. It's like, it's the worst thing that someone said to you.
Oh, yes, darling, but sometimes you have to say...
La 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 la. I mean, it's the only way to block them out. I love my kids, but I'm kicking them all out as soon as they're 18.
Yard box. Son is through. Knocks it past the defender. He takes a shot. What a goal! Right on the stroke of half.
Time for equality.
Absolutely right.
I mean, things have changed, but there's still so much more we can do. The real pressing danger is...
plastics. In some parts of the ocean, there are over 1 million...
stars in the sky, so bright that we can clearly see the...
Dark Side of the Moon. This is a classic.
Just epic. One of the all-time best.
I honestly think this album is going...
to live forever. Wants to live forever.
Oi! Don't forget me.
Thank you very much, everyone.